In the year 958, a local official in Dunhuang named Zhai Fengda lost his wife, Madame Ma. The surviving record tells us nothing about his grief. It records what he did next. After his wife's death, Zhai arranged for Buddhist scriptures to be copied on 10 appointed dates. The first came 7 days after her death. The last belonged to a stage the tradition called the third year. Why 10 dates? Because in the religious world Zhai knew, the dead did not face one immediate and final judgment. A soul was believed to pass through the courts of 10 underworld kings. Each court brought another review. Each deadline also gave the living another chance to act for the dead. The dead faced 10 courts. The living faced 10 deadlines. This is very different from the image many people now have of Chinese hell. Modern stories often present one supreme king of hell, or a vast prison divided into 18 levels. But the 10 kings were not simply another name for the 18 levels of hell. And in many widely circulated lists, the ruler called King Yama was only one judge among 10. So where did this system come from? Why did the afterlife begin to resemble a government office? And if people were responsible for their own karma, how could their families possibly help them after death? The answer lies where Buddhist ideas met older Chinese traditions, official procedure, and family obligation. Zhai Fengda lived in Dunhuang, an oasis city on the Silk Road in northwestern China. Travelers, merchants, monks, and officials moved through the region, carrying different languages and religious traditions with them. Buddhist texts were not only objects to be read. Copying or sponsoring them could also be treated as an act of religious merit. Zhai's record shows this ritual system entering the life of a real family. Madame Ma's death did not end the family's obligations. It started a calendar. On one side of that calendar, the deceased was believed to move from court to court. On the other, the living could sponsor scripture copying, make offerings, or hold ritual feasts at the proper time. Believers held that the merit created by these acts could be dedicated to the deceased. The hope was not to erase the consequences of an entire life. It was to help the dead through the dangers ahead and toward a better rebirth. What the record proves is limited, but important. It proves that Zhai arranged these rituals. It does not prove that 10 supernatural courts existed, or that the rites changed a verdict in another world. But by the 10th century, the 10 kings were no longer only figures in religious texts. Their schedule was shaping how an actual family responded to death. These 10 judges, however, had not always existed as one complete system. Long before the 10 kings took their later form, China already had several traditions about rulers of the dead. One source of the later system was Yama, a figure with roots in Indian traditions of death and judgment. As Buddhism traveled into China, Yama's name was translated and his role was reshaped. In Chinese, he became Dunhuang, the figure often called King Yama in English. But Yama entered an underworld that already had rulers of its own. One of those older powers was associated with Mount Tai, a sacred mountain in eastern China. Chinese traditions had long connected Mount Tai with human lifespans, the dead, and registers containing their names. The Lord of Mount Tai could be imagined as an official governing the departed. That matters because it gave death an administrative language. A lifespan could be entered in a register. A dead person could fall under the authority of an otherworldly official. The later bureaucracy of the 10 kings did not emerge from nothing. Earlier Chinese sources also imagined more than one authority over the dead. Their names and duties were not fixed. The 10 kings emerged in a religious landscape that already contained several ways of governing the afterlife. The 10 kings were therefore not a complete myth imported unchanged from India. Buddhism brought yama, karma, rebirth, and the dedication of merit. Older Chinese traditions supplied local rulers, sacred geography, and the language of registers. These elements were gradually reorganized into a sequence of judgment. That reorganization also changed Yama's position. In many common lists of the 10 kings, King Yama presides over the fifth court. He remains important, but he does not rule the entire underworld alone. The central question had changed. It was no longer only, who rules the dead? It had become, what process must the dead pass through? And that process looked increasingly familiar. It looked like government. The language of medieval administration offered a familiar model. Cases could move through officials, documents, deadlines, and layers of review. Authority worked through procedure. The underworld of the 10 kings used similar language. Kings judged. Clerks recorded. The deeds of the dead appeared as if they had been entered into case files. After one hearing, the soul moved on to another court. Imagine a case passing through 10 official windows. At each window, another part of the record is examined before the case can continue. The comparison is not exact. The underworld was never a copy of one real government office. But the model helps explain why the system could feel understandable to people who lived with paperwork, officials, and layered authority. Bureaucracy did not invent hell. It gave hell a procedure people could recognize. That distinction is essential. The surviving evidence does not show that the Tang government designed the 10 kings or imposed their worship across the empire. A more careful explanation is that monks, ritual specialists, artists, and believers used a familiar model of authority. Courts, records, and deadlines made an invisible system of karma easier to describe. By the late Tang and Five Dynasties periods, this system had left a substantial written record. Dozens of Dunhuang manuscripts connected with the 10 kings have survived. They are not all identical. Their differences show that the tradition did not begin as one stable text accepted everywhere in exactly the same form. Some of these scriptures were also concerned with rites prepared by people while they were still alive. The living did not always wait for relatives to act after their death. They could create merit in advance. Within this religious logic, a good act performed in life could become preparation for the future. It was not a guaranteed pass through the courts. It was a way to prepare before someone else had to act on your behalf. The texts use Buddhist figures and Buddhist ideas about karma. Scholars generally understand the 10 Kings tradition as a system formed in the religious environment of China. It was not a complete institution translated directly from a Sanskrit original. Buddhism supplied the moral language. Chinese society helped reshape how that language was organized and explained. Now the judges were in place. The next question was how a dead person moved through their courts. According to 10 Kings texts, death was not followed by one final hearing. It was more like a case divided into 10 stages. The first 7 judgments came at 7-day intervals. The sequence began on the 7th day after death and ended on the 49th day. The 8th judgment came on the 100th day. The 9th came around the 1st anniversary. The 10th belonged to what the texts called the 3rd year. Later texts and ritual traditions did not always calculate those anniversaries in exactly the same way. So the 3rd year is best treated as the name of a ritual stage, not as one calendar rule followed everywhere. Death was not judged all at once. The case advanced one deadline at a time. Why divide judgment into 10 stages? The texts were not asking only whether someone was guilty or innocent. Karma involved the consequences of countless actions across an entire life. Those consequences would shape where the person was reborn. The 10 courts turned that invisible moral process into a sequence people could describe in stories, display in images, and mark through ritual. This is also why the English word hell can be misleading. In this Buddhist framework, punishment could be one stage within a much longer cycle. It was not necessarily an eternal destination. Judgment ultimately pointed toward rebirth. Punishment could be one stage. Rebirth was the next outcome. Later art often emphasized terrifying punishments, and those images became highly influential. But punishment was not the entire structure. At its core, The Ten Kings system was a chain of judgments deciding where the dead would go next. This is also why the 10 courts, and what English often calls the 18 levels of hell, should not be treated as identical systems. The 10 courts organize judges and a schedule of hearings. Traditions of 18 hells organize places or types of punishment. Later temple art, literature, drama, and popular storytelling often combine them. The 10 courts describe a judicial process. The 18 hells describe punishments and their locations. And because the process lasted so long, the living still had time to act. That created a difficult question. If karma belonged to the dead person, what could a family possibly change? Buddhist teachings placed moral responsibility on the individual. Relatives could not erase everything a dead person had done. But they could perform good acts of their own. Families might sponsor scripture copying, make offerings, hold ritual feasts, or recite sacred texts. They could then dedicate the merit of those acts to the deceased. Believers hoped this assistance might reduce difficulties and improve the chance of a favorable rebirth. This was not presented as a way to rewrite the dead person's entire moral record. The texts framed these rites as merit-making, not as a simple payment to a supernatural judge. The family offered help through actions that were themselves understood as good. When this idea met Chinese expectations of family responsibility, death was no longer a purely individual matter. 10 hearings for the dead became 10 deadlines for the living. Filial duty, the obligation to care for parents and family, could now continue beyond the funeral. Relatives could not carry all of the dead person's karma. But remembering the dates and completing the rites could become part of fulfilling their own duty. The surviving records show this system working in both directions. Some living believers prepared merit before death. Zhai Fengda acted after his wife's death had already begun a ritual calendar. For Zhai, this was not one funeral followed by an ending. It was a sequence stretching from the first week after Madame Ma's death to the stage called the third year. The record does not tell us exactly what Zhai believed about the underworld. It shows what he did. On appointed dates, he arranged for scriptures to be copied so that a living husband could still act for the dead. Here is the largest reversal in the story. The 10 kings seem to describe where the dead will go. But the system also tells the living when to act. The courts organized judgment for the dead and mourning for the living. Each deadline gave the living another opportunity to respond. The rites did not offer control over death, but they gave families something practical to do after death had taken control away. The underworld was invisible, and its scriptures could be difficult to follow. So how did 10 unseen courts become a world that almost anyone could understand? One answer survives in a Dunhuang scroll now catalogued as manuscript P2003. The scroll combines a text about the 10 kings with 14 illustrations. As viewers unrolled it, they did not see every image at once. Kings, officials, messengers, and souls awaiting judgment appeared in sequence. An invisible doctrine gained faces. A long process of judgment became a route the eye could follow. The kings often looked like officials from the human world. Clerks stood nearby to keep records. A viewer did not need advanced knowledge of Buddhist philosophy to understand the basic scene. A judge was hearing a case. A record was being examined. A soul was waiting for the result. The text explained the rules. The images made the rules visible. Ritual brought those rules into family life. The visual tradition did not remain in Dunhuang. A group of 10 kings' paintings from the Ningbo region dates to before 1195. The kings appear with scribes and other officials as they judge the dead. By then, the bureaucratic image of the afterlife had traveled across both time and geography. These paintings show how artists, patrons, and viewers imagined the underworld. They also show how an invisible system of judgment could be taught to people who might never study the scripture itself. But the farther the 10 kings traveled, the more their world changed. Did every region imagine the same judges in the same order? The Dunhuang manuscripts give a clear answer. Number the names, order, and duties of the kings could differ from one text to another. Variation was present within the early tradition itself. Over time, Buddhist, Taoist, and local religious traditions continued to absorb and rearrange underworld figures. Some versions emphasized judgment. Others focused more heavily on punishment. Other local figures of the underworld could also enter the picture. These differences were not simply mistakes made by people who had forgotten one official map. The map itself kept changing as the tradition spread. That makes it difficult to speak of one single Chinese hell accepted by every community from ancient times onward. A later list of 10 kings cannot simply be projected backward onto every believer in the Tang dynasty. What endured was not always a particular name or rank. It was a basic framework. The dead passed through several stages of judgment. Their actions were imagined as something that could be recorded and reviewed. Decisions unfolded according to a ritual schedule. Families could take part through actions of their own. The fixed list changed. The bureaucratic framework endured. That brings us back to the central question. In what sense did bureaucracy shape the afterlife in medieval China? The answer is not that the Chinese government invented hell. It is also not that people placed an exact copy of a real government office underground. Buddhism supplied moral cause and effect. Older traditions supplied rulers of the dead and otherworldly registers. Bureaucratic culture supplied courts, documents, deadlines, and layers of review. Family duty turned that process into action. That is the precise limit of the word shaped. Bureaucracy gave the 10 kings a form people could recognize, but it did not create the system by itself. The 10 kings were not a timeless Chinese myth. They were not a complete institution carried unchanged from India. And they were not a religious program designed by the state. They emerged gradually in medieval China as several traditions met and were reorganized. The system turned invisible karma into a procedure. It gave the living a sequence of responsibilities when death left them little control. Zhai Fengda's record gives that conclusion a human scale. After his wife's death, he arranged for scriptures to be copied on 10 appointed dates. We cannot know exactly what he expected those rites to change. But the document shows how the 10 kings gave a living husband a calendar of actions long after death. So the story of the 10 kings asks more than what happens after death. It asks a question for the living. When someone is gone, what can those who remain still do? This bureaucratic vision did not end with judges, files, and deadlines. People would eventually send something else into the world of the dead. Money made from paper. In the next episode, we will ask how paper offerings became currency for another world.